Hi everyone, now we're going to be working on question 3 from AQA GCSE English Language Paper 1. So we've looked at question 2, thanks for everyone who watched and left comments and likes and views. This motivated me to actually do question 3 and quickly. Okay, so question 3. In question 3, if we look at the screen, we now have to think about the whole source. So the question says, you now need to think about the whole source. The text is from the beginning of a short story. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops, any other structural features that interest you. Now, as it has highlighted, it might seem obvious, but you need to talk about the whole source, not just the beginning like you had in question 2, where they asked you to look at a specific number of lines, so lines 9 to 15. This is the whole source. It gives you a little bit of context. This is from the beginning of a short story. Why is this important information? It's because if this story was in the middle, so this short piece of text, if it was from the middle of a novel, you would expect there to be a different kind of structure, whereas if it's the beginning, they're still introducing the characters, they're still introducing the plot, they're still introducing the setting and anything to interest you as a reader. So, and as the question says, how has the writer structured the text to interest you? So you can think about your personal response to the text. When you're reading, what things did you notice interested you? Why did you want to keep reading? And now, what they're asking you to do is not look at the big themes or anything like that. This is your English language paper. So you need to look at how has the writer structured. So let me see if I can and we're looking at structure here. So structure, what are structural features? Well, you can look at what about the opening of the text? What happened in the first paragraph? Was there some exciting punctuation that made the first line grab your attention? Was there some descriptive language? What about how the writer has looked at telling the story in the beginning? Have they done a flashback? Have they done reported speech? Maybe it's a letter, maybe it's a character talking directly to the audience. Now, when it says in the next part, you could write about, this could here means you absolutely should. The examiner is telling you what they want to write about. So I suggest, because it is an 8-mark question, and 8-mark questions mean 2 to 3 paragraphs at most, no more. Paragraph 1, you should talk about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source. Then 2, how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops. So you will need to identify, when does the focus change? So focus, what does that mean? It means what the writer is pulling your attention to. What is the topic they're talking about? So how does it change? So first tell me what is the change, then how does the writer actually change your focus? So does he use language? Does he use new paragraphs? Does he use speech, etc.? And then why? Why does he change your focus? Now here you can look at, well, what's the significance of it? What does it do to you? Does it interest you more? And then third point is any other structural features that interest you. So this gives you leeway to talk about something else that you find interesting that hasn't been specifically said there. Because when we're looking at question 3 and when we're doing your English language exams, there's a lot of leeway in the marks for valid answers. But if you do not talk about what the writer brings your attention to in the first part and how it changes, because there is a change, as they've told you in those little clues, in those bullet points, unless you've got something really great to say that is fully backed up with evidence from the text, you are not going to get those 8 marks. So this is not a literature exam, this is a language exam. Look for how the language, how the text is actually constructed, and use that. You've got to explain those. So in a way, you're deconstructing a text, not the meaning, but the actual how it's put together. So let's go back over to the source keeping in mind this question, and see if we can find the answer. Okay, so here's our source. And remember, this is source A, taken from the beginning of a short story written by Joanne Harris by Mr. Fisher, a teacher of English for 40 years, works at St Oswald's Grammar School for boys. So remember, let's look at the beginning. So our first point is to look at, well, what does he say in the beginning? Okay, so the very beginning of the story. Mr. Fisher lived alone in a small terraced house in the centre of town. He did not own a car and therefore preferred to do as much as he could of his weekend marking in the form room after school. Even so, there were usually 2 or 3 stacks of books and papers to take home on the bus. So here, the first paragraph is talking about Mr. Fisher. So let's make a note of that. So we find out about the character. What do we find out about Mr. Fisher? We find out he lives alone. He doesn't own a car. And remember from question 1, you will have listed some of this. And he prefers to do his marking at school. Okay, so we're learning about the character. In paragraph 2, it had been a disappointing term in St Oswald's. For most of the boys in 3F, creative writing was on par with country dancing and food technology. Oh, he'd tried to engage their interest, but books just didn't seem to kindle the same enthusiasm as they had in the old days. Okay, so let's think about this section here. So we learn about who Mr. Fisher, like details about Mr. Fisher, not who he is a person, but like where he lives. It's setting the scene almost. And then there's a second paragraph. We learn more about Mr. Fisher's feelings and his job, because we know he's a teacher. So he's feeling disappointed. And what's interesting, I think we can notice, is that Mr. Fisher's a teacher, but also let's talk about the narrating voice. Is it first person or is it third person? So first person is I, me. Third person is he, she, it. So can you look at the text and identify? Is it in the first person or the third person? You're right, it is in third person. So I'll just write a P there for person. Okay. What happens next? We have a whole paragraph, as you know from question 2, talking about how Mr. Fisher felt about the previous novels that he had read and why they were so amazing. So we've got to change actually in the language a little bit between the first couple paragraphs and the third one, where we've got setting the scene about who Mr. Fisher is, where he works, and then about his feelings to do with the books. We get into a much more specific language, specific ideas about what he thinks in his mind, rather than just generalities. Okay, let's go on to the rest of the text, because remember, we do need to read the whole text. And now we're starting to look at, well, where does it change? How and why? So let's keep reading. So now everything was in black and white, and though Mr. Fisher continued to teach with as much devotion to duty as he had 40 years before, he was secretly aware that his voice had begun to lack conviction. To these boys, these sullen boys with their gelled hair and perfect teeth, everything was boring. Shakespeare was boring, Dickens was boring. There didn't seem to be a single story left in the world that they hadn't heard before, and over the years, though he had tried to stop it, a terrible disillusionment had crept over Mr. Fisher, who had once dreamed so fiercely of writing stories of his own. They had come to the end of the seam, he understood. There were no more stories to be written. The magic had run out. This was an uncharacteristically gloomy train of thought, and Mr. Fisher pushed it away. Not all his boys lacked imagination. Alistair Tibbet, for instance, even though he had obviously done part of his homework on the bus, an amiable boy, this Tibbet. Not a brilliant scholar by any means, but there was a spark in him which deserved attention. Mr. Fisher took a deep breath and looked down at Tibbet's exercise book, trying not to think of the snow outside and the 5 o'clock bus he was now almost certain to miss. 4 books to go, he told himself, and then home, dinner, bed, the comforting small routine of a winter weekend. But gradually, sitting there in the warm classroom with the smell of chalk and floor polish in his nostrils, Mr. Fisher began to experience a very strange sensation. It began as a tightening in his diaphragm, as if a long unused muscle had been brought into action. His breathing quickened, stopped, quickened again. He began to sweat, and when he reached the end of the story, Mr. Fisher put down his red pen and went back to the beginning, rereading every word very slowly with meticulous care. Okay, before we go on to the second page with the last 2 paragraphs, let's look at this part of the source. So, a good way actually, when you are analysing a text as a whole, is to look at each paragraph and just summarise what each paragraph is talking about. So we've done that with the first 3. I know I haven't written notes. Maybe I'll put those in when I'm editing. But let's look at, okay, we'll just summarise these first. So we've got description of where Mr. Fisher works and lives. Second paragraph is talking about St. Oswald's, the school he's at, and how Mr. Fisher feels. Then we've got a memory from Mr. Fisher about how he used to enjoy books. Now, this 4th paragraph, Mr. Fisher continues to think about his experience with the boys. So there's a similarity between paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. But what's interesting is here in the 5th paragraph, this was an uncharacteristically gloomy train of thought, and Mr. Fisher pulled it away. So this is interesting, and I find it interesting because there is a change. Now, why is this interesting? Now, this is interesting because it brings us back into the present. So what we've had so far is descriptions by our omniscient narrator, because we know it's written in the 3rd person. It's not Mr. Fisher narrating this. It's someone else. It's someone who has insight into Mr. Fisher's brain. So we've got an omniscient narrator here. That's a structural feature that you can talk about. And what happens with this structural feature is that line 25, the narrator brings us into the present. And it shows that these thoughts that Mr. Fisher is having here are what Mr. Fisher is thinking about now. So the first 2 paragraphs, the narrator introduces us to one of our main characters. He introduces us to our setting, St. Oswald's School. And then we're given insight into his thoughts, how he's feeling. But we don't know that it's in the present until we get to line 25, where this is an uncharacteristically gloomy train of thought and Mr. Fisher pushed it away. So Mr. Fisher pushed it away, it indicates that it's happening now. And then he goes on to continue reflecting. Not all his boys lacked imagination, so he thinks about Alistair Tibbet. So this is another thought here. Excuse my handwriting. I am not doing this with my iPad pen. I'm doing this with my trackpad on my laptop. Then we've got line 29. We are again in the present. Mr. Fisher took a deep breath and looked down at Tibbet's exercise book, trying not to think of the snow outside and the 5 o'clock bus he was now almost certain to miss, sorry. So we've got more of Mr. Fisher's internal thoughts, but then he's sitting there and reading this book, and it's almost like they're building the tension through these Mr. Fisher's internal thoughts, because it's setting the scene saying, Mr. Fisher is unhappy and he is not looking forward to marking this work. He wants to go home because we've seen the phrase, the comforting small routine of a winter weekend. He's comfortable. He can go home. He can have his dinner. He can go to sleep in his, what I assume is a comfortable bed. But while he's marking this work, as we find out in this last paragraph, there is a change. He's experiencing a very strange sensation. And here the tension starts to build, a tightening in his diaphragm. So his diaphragm is his tummy. As if a long unused muscle had been brought into action. So long unused. Something that's been forgotten. His breathing quickened, stopped, quickened again. He began to sweat. And you're thinking, well, what's happening here? What's happening? I want to know, because they're not telling us. The narrator is not telling us. And when he reached the end of the story, Mr. Fisher put down his red pen and went back to the beginning. Well, that's surprising. I mean, why does a teacher mark your work? I mean, I ask my students this. Your teachers mark your work and your examiners mark your papers. Some students think it's because it's the goodness of your heart, but really, actually, the only reason we teachers mark anything is because we're getting paid to. As blunt as that sounds, but that's the reason. We would not mark your work if we did not get paid. Unless we liked you very, very much, but 30 papers? No, thank you. Okay. And then Mr. Fisher rereads every word very slowly and meticulous with care. Well, that's a change because Mr. Fisher, up at the top, if we look, has talked about how the average creative writing for boys in 3F was on par with country dancing and food technology. Disappointing. Books, they weren't interested in books. He's saying that the boys, this is in paragraph 5, that the boys, they're just not interested. They've seen all the stories. They're bored by Dickens. They're bored by Shakespeare. Everything is boring. Sullen. Sullen means, well, when you're just like, right, can't bothered. But here we go. There is a change in Mr. Fisher. And here we are shown there is quite a change. So if we're thinking about structural features, as we have to with this question, we've got the beginning interests us because it sets the scene. We find out a little bit about Mr. Fisher. He lives alone. He doesn't own a car. That's maybe a little bit unusual. He works at school, and then we're told about how he's sad, but how he remembers his past. And you can say that the use of language in paragraph 3 develops on Mr. Fisher's thoughts and why he's excited by books. But you're also told that things are disappointing at St. Oswald's. So that makes you think, well, why are they disappointing? And there's short sentences here as well. They're short, actually a lot of them are short, brief sentences all the way through this beginning part until we get down a bit later. And here we have a change. We're brought into the present. So in line 25, we are shown we are in the present. It's not someone else recording the past, something that's already happened. The narrator saying, all these thoughts are happening right now in Mr. Fisher's head as he's sitting here in the classroom looking at the book he is about to mark, knowing he is not going to be home just after 5 o'clock. He's going to miss the bus. And then this last paragraph of page 1, we've noticed, well, we're not finding out why. Why is Mr. Fisher's experiencing a strange sensation? Why is his breathing quickening and then stopping and then quickening again? Why is he beginning to sweat? Is it something really bad? Is it something really good? Because if a teacher rereads something very slowly or meticulously with care, it's either because it's very, very good or it's absolutely abysmal and they have to do that because it's too difficult to read otherwise. So let's look at the end and see what the last two paragraphs bring us. This must be what a prospector feels when, discouraged and bankrupt and ready to go home, he takes off his boots and shakes out a nugget of gold the size of his fist. He read it again, critically this time, marking off the paragraphs with notes in red. A hope, which at first Mr. Fisher had hardly dared to formulate, swelled in him and grew strong. He found himself beginning to smile. If anyone had asked him what Tibbet's story was about, Mr. Fisher might have been hard put to reply. There were themes he recognised, elements of plot which were vaguely familiar, an adventure, a quest, a child, a man. But to explain Tibbet's story in these terms was as meaningless as trying to describe a loved one's face in terms of nose, eyes, mouth. This was something new, something entirely original. So here in the structure, in the last paragraph, the writer built the tension by not telling us exactly what had happened. And he's continuing here by not exactly telling us what Mr. Fisher is excited about, but giving us an idea. This must be what a prospector feels when, discouraged and bankrupt and ready to go home, he takes off his boots and shakes out a nugget of gold the size of his fist. So it's almost like a comparison. He's saying, he's inferring, he's imagining, this must be what a prospector feels like. And if you don't know the word prospector, look at the rest of the sentence so that you can figure out what it could be. So in this case, if you look at the rest of the sentence, a prospector is someone digging for gold, panning for gold as they call it, where they spend hours and hours and hours of work not getting anywhere, and then suddenly they accidentally find something. You can think about your own experience and say, well, have you tried to do something or tried to find something and you can't find it, you can't find it, you can't find it, and then suddenly it's just there and you're like, oh. Okay, Mr. Fisher, he read it again, critically this time. So when you read critically, you're looking at the bad and the good, and you're looking at it very closely, marking off paragraphs with notes in red. A hope which at first Mr. Fisher had hardly dared to formulate swelled in him and grew strong. So we can start to feel the excitement. Because also, if you see with the different paragraphs, the narrator is using groups of three quite a lot to describe feelings. So if we go back to the other paragraph, we've got here, breathing quickened, stopped, quickened again. That's a group of three. So we've got repetition of similar word groups or the same word to give us this idea of a quickening action. So let's go back to these. Okay, he found himself beginning to smile. Again, short sentences, it builds the momentum, it stops. Because if you've got long sentences, it's a long train of thought, it's a much more flowing idea. Whereas if you've got lists, short sentences, it's a much faster pace, which, as a reader, can make you more interested because you're having to go stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. It's almost like a train that chugs along and it keeps moving. So if anyone had asked him what Tibbet's story was about, Mr. Fisher might have been hard to reply. So here, Mr. Fisher actually is analysing. He's excited. He can't put it into words exactly, but he sees things that he used to remember. So this is referencing back to the beginning. We'll look at paragraph 3, where he explains why he was so excited about stories of the past, because they leapt like gazelles, they pounced like tigers. You had all those similes, and here we've got him saying there's something vaguely familiar. And again, we've got groups of 3, an adventure. And now he's explaining an adventure, what's included. Here's our group of 3 again, a quest, a child, a man. And if you notice, he sometimes uses an and in his group of 3, but not always. So think about, if you take out the and, does it still make grammatical sense? Yes, but what does it change? Here's another group of 3, nose, eyes, mouth. It builds the momentum again and again and again. It makes you kind of breathless, almost like you're trying to run and you're so excited about something you can't hold it in. And this is how it changes through the text. You've got the language and the structure of the sentences as well as the paragraphs that take you from something introducing, something nice. Then you've got Mr. Fisher's reminiscence. He's reminiscing about this forgotten past, these forgotten stories, and how amazing it was. He talks about what the problem is, and then he's like, oh my goodness, I found something. So that is an analysis of the text. Now let's look about how we start formulating this information into an answer. Okay, so I highly recommend that you plan your answer for this, even if it's a very, very short plan. So what I'm going to do here when we're looking at the question is, once you've looked at the question, you've gone back to the text, you've found things that you think will be useful. I also recommend, if you think there's information that is useful, put a number 3 next to it. You can highlight, and I highly, highly, highly recommend, like we've done with the text, underlining or highlighting sentences, quotes that you could use when you're reading through and when you're analysing, and note down your initial reactions in the margins here of the question, so that when you're coming to plan and writing your answer, you can just go back to it quickly. Now, for a question 8, you're not going to be doing a really full plan in your exam. You don't have time for it. You'll have like not many minutes to write this question. You've got like literally 10 to 12 minutes to read, plan and write this answer. So you need to be fast. So what I suggest is you be really, really logical in the way you approach this. So paragraph 1 is bullet point 1. So let's look at what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source. So focus at beginning of source. So we know that paragraph 1 and 2 is about, well, is introducing Mr. Fisher, where he lives and works, and his class. Easy peasy. And you can use quotes. I highly recommend quotes. Paragraph 2 and 3 talks about Mr. Fisher's thoughts to do with 3F. And remember to have correct punctuation in your exam because you get marked as bag. And you can use them. Let's look at some quotes. So, and also you can put a line number. So in your paper when you're writing, you can write a line. So line 5, disappointing term at St. Oswald's. You've also got Mr. F's thoughts on books of the past. Books were golden. Here. So here we've got just the first 3 paragraphs, the beginning, nice and simple. Then we've got how and why the writer changes the focus. Now, and this is as the source develops, remember. So when you're reading the question as well, you can highlight key words and phrases in the paper, and I highly recommend you do that. I have another video where you can look through and survey the paper itself, and I will put a link in the description. I'll see if I can put a link here as well, so you can just click on it. But I highly recommend underlining and highlighting keywords and phrases in the text. So let's look at how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops. So here when we're talking about 2 to 3 paragraphs, the 3rd paragraph actually, you can talk about different parts of the text in different paragraphs. So I'm going to talk about up to paragraph 3 in the 1st paragraph. Then I'm going to talk about paragraph 4 to 5, I think, in this next one. So he's got, this is the start of a chain, start of change. And we've got paragraph 4, Mr. Fisher complains about, he complains and is sad about the fact the boys don't like books and they've heard all the stories before. So here you can also talk about how you start to see how sad Mr. Fisher is, because in paragraph 3 here we've got how we can see that Mr. Fisher loves books. He thinks they're great and he had a different experience of learning about books. So here you can see the change where you've got Mr. Fisher's internal thoughts. We can write a note about that. Mr. Fisher's internal thoughts told to us by omniscient narrator. Let's see what else. Short sentences that show the, let's see, sadness Mr. F feels. So here, this next paragraph could be quite a short one. And then we've got the change, really. So as you can see, actually, I like to put little headings because then I know what point I'm trying to make in this paragraph, because each paragraph needs to talk about one idea, one point, because otherwise it just gets too confusing and it's not nice as an examiner to read. And when you are writing an exam paper, you want to make your writing structure as clear, simple and easy to understand as possible, because your examiner could be marking your exam first thing in the morning when they're fresh, or last thing at night when they just really want to bed and don't want to read your paper. So if you make it as easy as possible, all they need to do is tick, 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 and you're going to make their life so much easier, which means they'll probably want to mark your paper a bit better, because it's easy to. So do yourself a favour by making the examiner's life easier. Right, so the change. So this is from line 25. As a reader, we find out that we are in the present time, which is interesting because we didn't know that before as a reader. And it makes, what does it make you feel if you know that you've gone from like almost like a time in limbo to, oh, the story's in the present, we want to know what happens next. So that's good. If we don't know that before as a reader, now we want to know what is happening now and next in the story. And here you can quote line 25, sorry. So put a note, quote line 25. So when you're planning your answer as well, you can just put line numbers so that you know which to go back to. And if you've already highlighted them on your source, then that'll be really easy. Okay. Then let's look at the structural features that the writer uses. So how has the writer structured the text to interest you? So we have focus at the beginning, setting the scene. So let's write setting the scene. The start of the change is Mr. F's internal thoughts, and then the change is we're brought into present. And when we're in the present, we find out that Mr. Fisher is marking a paper. So Mr. F is marking a story that we know from the previous information he expected to be bad. He expected it to be bad, boring, not interesting. But we are finding out from lines 34 over here, line 34, that he's having a strange experience. His breath, he's starting to get excited. Line 34 to, let's see how many lines that has. That's 34, 35, 36, 37, 38 to 38. Mr. Fisher is having a strange sensation. Okay, let's move this. He's having a strange sensation. And then final two paragraphs. Well, probably more final paragraph. Final two paragraphs find out that he is excited about Tibbet's story because it reminds him of the stories he loved to read. Okay, that's it. Now, these paragraphs will be different sizes because some will need more detail than others, but I said 2 to 3 paragraphs. It really depends on the text and how you want to split it up. I have decided to talk about each section in talk about the text in 3 different paragraphs because it talks about the 3 different parts of the text. One is setting the scene, one is Mr. Fisher's internal thoughts, and the one is the change where the audience is brought back to the present. Now, because a paragraph is 1 point, you're talking about one idea in one paragraph. You do never have 2 points in a paragraph. It is just too confusing. Okay, so now that we have gone through the source, selected quotes, we have planned our answer, and you'll do a short version of this in your exam. Now we're going to write our answer.